Section 10 of Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by William Tomko. Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 1. Exploration of the World by Jules Verne. First Part, Chapter 5. Ibn Battuta, 1328 to 1353. Marco Polo had returned to his native land now nearly 25 years, when a Franciscan monk traversed the whole of Asia from the Black Sea to the extreme limits of China, passing by Trebizond, Mount Ararat, Babel, and the island of Java. But he was so credulous of all that was told him, and his narrative is so confused, that but little reliance can be placed upon it. It is the same with the fabulous travels of Jean de Mandeville. Cooley says of them, "They are so utterly untrue that they have not their parallel in any language." But we find a worthy successor to the Venetian traveller in an Arabian theologian named Abdallah el Lawati, better known by the name of Ibn Battuta. He did for Egypt, Arabia, Anatolia, Tartary, India, China, Bengal, and Sudan what Marco Polo had done for Central Asia, and he is worthy to be placed in the foremost rank as a brave traveller and bold explorer. In the year 1324, the 725th year of the Hegira, he resolved to make a pilgrimage to Mecca, and starting from Tangier, his native town, he went first to Alexandria, and thence to Cairo. During his stay in Egypt he turned his attention to the Nile, and especially to the Delta. Then he tried to sail up the river, but being stopped by disturbances on the Nubian frontier, he was obliged to return to the mouth of the river and then set sail for Asia Minor. After visiting Gaza, the tombs of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Tyre, then strongly fortified and unassailable on three sides, and Tiberias, which was in ruins, and whose celebrated baths were completely destroyed, Ibn Battuta was attracted by the wonders of Lebanon, the centre for all the hermits of that day, who had judiciously chosen one of the most lovely spots in the whole world wherein to end their days. Then passing Baalbek and going on to Damascus, he found the city, in the year 1345, decimated by the plague. This fearful scourge devoured 24,000 persons daily, if we may believe his report, and Damascus would have been depopulated, had not the prayers of all the people offered up in the mosque, containing the stone with the print of Moses' foot upon it, been heard and answered. On leaving Damascus, Ibn Battuta went to Mesjid, where he visited the tomb of Ali, which attracts a large number of paralytic pilgrims who need only to spend one night in prayer beside it to be completely cured. Battuta does not seem to doubt the authenticity of this miracle, well known in the East under the title of the Night of Cure. From Mesjid the traveller went to Bussorah, and entered the kingdom of Ispahan, and then the province of Shiraz, where he wished to converse with the celebrated worker of miracles, Magd Aden. From Shiraz he went to Baghdad, to Tabriz, then to Medina, where he prayed beside the tomb of the Prophet, and finally to Mecca, where he remained 3 years. It is well known that from Mecca caravans are continually starting for the surrounding country, and it was in company with some of these bold merchants that Ibn Battuta was able to visit the towns of Yemen. He went as far as Aden, at the mouth of the Red Sea, and embarked for Zaila, one of the Abyssinian ports. He was now once more on African ground, and advanced into the country of the Berbers, that he might study the manners and customs of those dirty and repulsive tribes. He found their diet consisted wholly of fish and camel's flesh, but in the town of Makdasbu there was an attempt at comfort and civilization, presenting a most agreeable contrast with the surrounding squalor. The inhabitants were very fat, each of them, to use Ibn's own expression, eating enough to feed a convent. They were very fond of delicacies, such as plantains boiled in milk, preserved citrons, pods of fresh pepper, and green ginger. After seeing all he wished of the country of the Berbers, chiefly on the coast, he resolved to go to Zanguebar, and then, crossing the Red Sea and following the coast of Arabia, he came to Zafar, a town situated upon the Indian Ocean. The vegetation of this country is most luxuriant, the betel, cocoa nut, and incense trees forming there great forests. Still the traveller pushed on, and came to Ormuz on the Persian Gulf, and passed through several provinces of Persia. We find him a second time at Mecca in the year 1332, 3 years after he had left it. But this was only to be a short rest for the traveller, for now, leaving Asia for Africa, he went to Upper Egypt, a region but little known, and thence to Cairo. He next visited Syria, making a short way at Jerusalem and Tripoli, and thence he visited the Turkomans of Anatolia, where the confraternity of young men gave him a most hearty welcome. After Anatolia, the Arabian narrative speaks of Asia Minor. Ibn Batuta advanced as far as Erzerum, where he was shown an aerolite weighing 620 pounds. Then, crossing the Black Sea, he visited the Crimea, Kaffa, and Bulgar, a town of sufficiently high latitude for the unequal length of day and night to be very marked. And at last he reached Astrakhan, at the mouth of the Volga, where the Khan of Tartary lived during the winter months. The Princess Bailun, the wife of the Khan, and daughter of the Emperor of Constantinople, was wishing to visit her father, and it was an opportunity not to be lost by Ibn Batuta for exploring Turkey in Europe. He gained permission to accompany the Princess, who set out attended by 5,000 men, and followed by a portable mosque, which was set up at every place where they stayed. The Princess's reception at Constantinople was very magnificent, the bells being rung with such spirit that he says even the horizon seemed full of the vibration. The welcome given to the theologian by the princes of the country was worthy of his fame. He remained in the city 36 days, so that he was able to study it in all its details. This was a time when communication between the different countries was both dangerous and difficult, and Ibn Batuta was considered a very bold traveller. Egypt, Arabia, Turkey in Asia, the Caucasian provinces had all in turn been explored by him. After such hard work he might well have taken rest and been satisfied with the laurels that he had gained, for he was without doubt the most celebrated traveller of the 14th century. But his insatiable passion for travelling remained, and the circle of his explorations was still to widen considerably. On leaving Constantinople, Ibn Batuta went again to Astrakhan, thence crossing the sandy wastes of the present Turkestan, he arrived at Khovarezen, a large populous town, then at Bokhara, half destroyed by the armies of Genghis Khan. Some time after we hear of him at Samarcand, a religious town which greatly pleased the learned traveller, and then at Balkh, which he could not reach without crossing the desert of Khorasan. This town was all in ruins, and desolate, for the armies of the barbarians had been there, and Ibn Batuta could not remain in it, but wished to go westward to the frontier of Afghanistan. The mountainous country near the Hindu Kush range confronted him, but this was no barrier to him, and after great fatigue, which he bore with equal patience and good humour, he reached the important town of Herat. This was the most westerly point reached by the traveller. He now resolved to change his course for an easterly one, and in going to the extreme limits of Asia, to reach the shores of the Pacific. If he could succeed in this, he would pass the bounds of the exploration of the celebrated Marco Polo. He set out, and following the course of the river Kabul and the frontiers of Afghanistan, he came to the Sindhu, the modern Indus, and descended it to its mouth. From the town of Lahore he went to Delhi, which great and beautiful city had been deserted by its inhabitants, who had fled from the Emperor Mohammed. This tyrant, who was occasionally both generous and magnificent, received the Arabian traveller very well, made him a judge in Delhi, and gave him a grant of land with some pecuniary advantages that were attached to the post. But these honors were not to be of any long duration, for Ibn Batuta, being implicated in a pretended conspiracy, thought it best to give up his place, and make himself a fakir to escape the emperor's displeasure. Mohammed, however, pardoned him, and made him his ambassador to China. Fortune again smiled upon the courageous traveller, and he had now the prospect of seeing these distant lands under exceptionally good and safe circumstances. He was charged with presents for the Emperor of China, and 2,000 horse soldiers were given him as an escort. But Ibn Batuta had not thought of the insurgents who occupied the surrounding countries. A skirmish took place between the escort and the Hindus, and the traveller, being separated from his companions, was taken prisoner, robbed, garroted, and carried off he knew not whither. But his courage and hopefulness did not forsake him, and he contrived to escape from the hands of these robbers. After wandering about for 7 days, he was received into his house by a negro, who at length led him back to the emperor's palace at Delhi. Mohammed fitted out another expedition, and again appointed the Arabian traveller as his ambassador. This time they passed through the enemy's country without molestation, and by way of Kanoje, Mersa, Gwalior, and Barun, they reached Malabar. Some time after, they arrived at the great port of Calicut, an important place, which became afterwards the chief town of Malabar. Here they were detained by contrary winds for 3 months, and made use of this time to study the Chinese mercantile marine which frequented this port. Ibn speaks with great admiration of these junks, which are like floating gardens, where ginger and herbs are grown on deck. They are each like a separate village, and some merchants were the possessors of a great number of these junks. At last the wind changed. Ibn Batuta chose a small junk well fitted up, to take him to China, and had all his property put on board. 13 other junks were to receive the presents sent by the King of Delhi to the Emperor of China, but during the night a violent storm arose, and all the vessels sank. Fortunately for Ibn, he had remained on shore to attend the service at the mosque, and thus his piety saved his life, but he had lost everything except the carpet which he used at his devotions. After the second misfortune he could not make up his mind to appear before the King of Delhi. This catastrophe was enough to weary the patience of a more long-suffering emperor than Mohammed. Ibn soon made up his mind what to do. Leaving the service of the emperor, and the advantages attaching to the post of ambassador, he embarked for the Maldive Islands, which were governed by a woman, and where a large trade in cocoa was carried on. Here he was again made a judge, but this was only of short duration, for the Vizier became jealous of his success, and after marrying 3 wives, Ibn was obliged to take refuge in flight. He hoped to reach the Coromandel coast, but contrary winds drove his vessel towards Ceylon, where he was very well received, and gained the king's permission to climb the sacred mountain of Serendid, or Adam's Peak. His object was to see the wonderful impression of a foot at the summit, where the Hindus called Buddhas, and the Mahometans Adam's foot. He pretends, in his narrative, that this impression measures 11 hands in length, a very different account from that of an historian of the 9th century, who declared it to be 79 cubits long. This historian also adds that while one of the feet of our forefather rested on the mountain, the other was in the Indian Ocean. Ibn Batuta speaks also of large bearded apes, forming a considerable item in the population of the island, and said to be under a king of their own, crowned with leaves. We can give what credit we like to such fables as these, which were propagated by the credulity of the Hindus. From Ceylon the traveller made his way to the Coromandel coast, but not without experiencing some severe storms. He crossed to the other side of the Indian peninsula, and again embarked. But his vessel was seized by pirates, and Ibn Batuta arrived at Calicut almost without clothes, robbed and worn out with fatigue. No misfortune could damp his ardor. His was one of those great spirits which seem only invigorated by trouble and disasters. As soon as he was enabled by the kindness of some Delhi merchants to resume his travels, he embarked for the Maldive Islands, went on to Bengal, there set sail for Sumatra, and disembarked at one of the Nicobar Islands, after a very bad passage which had lasted 50 days. 15 days afterwards he arrived at Sumatra, where the king gave him a hearty welcome and furnished him with means to continue his journey to China. A junk took him in 71 days to the port Kailuka, capital of a country somewhat problematical, of which the brave and handsome inhabitants excelled in making arms. From Kailuka Ibn passed into the Chinese provinces, and went first to the splendid town of Zaitem, probably the present Tsuen Tcheou of the Chinese, a little to the north of Nankin. He passed through various cities of this great empire, studying the customs of the people, and admiring everywhere the riches, industry, and civilization that he found, but he did not get as far as the Great Wall, which he calls the obstacle of Gog and Magog. It was while he was exploring this immense tract of country that he made a short stay in the city of Tchensi, which is composed of 6 fortified towns standing together. It happened that during his wanderings he was able to be present at the funeral of a Khan, who was buried with 4 slaves, 6 of his favorites, and 4 horses. In the meanwhile disturbances had occurred at Zaitem, which obliged Ibn to leave this town, so he set sail for Sumatra, and then, after touching at Calicut and Ormuz, he returned to Mecca in 1348, having made the tour of Persia and Syria. But the time of rest had not yet come for this indefatigable explorer. The following year he revisited his native place of Tangier, and then, after travelling in the southern countries of Europe, he returned to Morocco, went to Soudan and the countries watered by the Niger, crossed the Great Desert, and entered Timbuktu, thus making a journey which would have rendered illustrious a less ambitious traveller. This was to be his last expedition. In 1353, 29 years after leaving Tangier for the first time, he returned to Morocco, and settled at Fez. He has earned the reputation of being the most intrepid explorer of the 14th century, and well merits to be ranked next after Marco Polo, the illustrious Venetian. End of first part, Chapter 5. Recording by William Tomko. Section 11 of Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by William Tomko. Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 1. Exploration of the World by Jules Verne. First part, Chapter 6. Part 1. Jean de Bethencourt, 1339 to 1425. Jean de Bethencourt was born about the year 1339 at Eau in Normandy. He was of good family, and Baron of Saint Martin le Gaillard, and had distinguished himself both as a navigator and warrior. He was made chamberlain to Charles VI. But his tastes were more for travelling than a life at court. He resolved to make himself a still more illustrious name by further conquests, and soon an opportunity offered for him to carry out his plans. On the coast of Africa there is a group of islands called the Canaries, which were once known as the Fortunate Islands. Juba, a son of one of the Numidian kings, is said to have been their first explorer, about the year of Rome 776. In the Middle Ages, according to some accounts, Arabs, Genoese, Portuguese, Spaniards, and Biscayans had partially visited this interesting group of islands. In 1393, a Spanish gentleman named Almonaster, who was commanding an expedition, succeeded in landing on Lancerota, one of these islands, and brought back, with several prisoners, some produce which was a sufficient guarantee of the fertility of this archipelago. The Norman cavalier now found the opening that he sought, and he determined to conquer the Canary Islands and try to convert the inhabitants to the Catholic faith. He was as intelligent, brave, and full of resources as he was energetic, and leaving his house of Grainville la Teinturière at Caux, he went to La Rochelle, where he met the Chevalier Gadifer de la Salle, and having explained his project to him, they decided to go to the Canary Islands together. Jean de Bethencourt, having collected an army and made his preparations, and had vessels fitted out and manned, Gadifer and he set sail. After experiencing adverse winds on the way to the Ile de Ré, and being much harassed by the constant dissensions on board, they arrived at Vivero, and then at Corunna. Here they remained 8 days, then set sail again, and doubling Cape Finisterre, followed the Portuguese coast to Cape St. Vincent, and arrived at Cadiz, where they made a longer stay. Here Bethencourt had a dispute with some Genoese merchants, who accused him of having taken their vessel, and he had to go to Seville, where King Henry III heard his complaint, and acquitted him from all blame. On his return to Cadiz, he found part of his crew in open mutiny, and some of his sailors so frightened that they refused to continue the voyage. So the Chevalier sent back the cowardly sailors, and set sail with those who were more courageous. The vessel in which Jean de Bethencourt sailed was becalmed for 3 days. Then, the weather improving, he reached the island of Graciosa, one of the smaller of the Canary group, in 5 days, and then the larger island of Lancerota, which is nearly the same size as the island of Rhodes. Lancerota has an excellent pasturage and arable land, which is particularly good for the cultivation of barley. Its numerous fountains and cisterns are well supplied with excellent water. The orchilla, which is so much used in dyeing, grows abundantly here. The inhabitants of this island, who as a rule wear scarce any clothing, are tall and well made, and the women, who wear leathern greatcoats reaching to the ground, are very good looking and honest. The traveller, prior to disclosing his plans of conquest, wished to possess himself of some of the natives, but his ignorance of the country made this a difficult matter. So, anchoring under the shelter of a small island in the archipelago, he called a meeting of his companions to decide upon a plan of action. They all agreed that the only thing to be done was to take some of the natives by fair means or foul. Guardafia, the king of the island, treated Bethencourt more as a friend than a subject. A castle, or rather fort, was built at the southwestern extremity of the island, and some men left there under the command of Berthin de Berneval, while Bethencourt set out with the rest of his followers for the island of Urbania or Fortaventura. Gadifer counselled by debarkation by night, which was done, and then he took the command of a small body of men and scoured the island with them for 8 days without meeting one native, they having all fled to the mountains. Provisions failing, Gadifer was forced to return, and he went to the island of Lobos, between Lancerota and Fortaventura. But there his chief sailor mutinied, and it was not without difficulty that Gadifer and Bethencourt reached the fort on Lancerota. Bethencourt resolved to return to Spain to get provisions and a new contingent of soldiers, for his crew he could not depend upon. So he left Gadifer in command, and set sail for Spain in one of Gadifer's ships. It will be remembered that Berthin de Berneval had been left in command of the fort on Lancerota Island. Unfortunately, he was Gadifer's bitter enemy, and no sooner had Bethencourt set out than he tried to poison the minds of Gadifer's men against him. He succeeded in inducing some, especially the Gascons, to revolt against the governor, who, quite innocent of Berneval's base designs, was spending his time hunting sea wolves on the island of Lobos with Ramonet de Levedin and several others. Ramonet, having been sent to Lancerota for provisions, found no Berneval there, he having deserted the island with his accomplices for a port on Graciosa, where a coxswain, deceived by his promises, had placed his vessel at his disposal. From Graziosa the traitor Berneval returned to Lancerota, and put the finishing stroke to his villainy by pretending to make an alliance with the king of the island. The king, thinking that no officer of Béthencourt's, in whom he had implicit confidence, could deceive him, came with 24 of his subjects to see Berneval, who seized them when asleep, had them bound, and then carried them off to Graziosa. The king managed to break his bonds, set 3 of his men free, and succeeded in escaping, but the remainder of his unfortunate companions were still prisoners, and Berneval gave them up to some Spanish thieves, who took them away to sell in a foreign land. Berneval's evil deeds did not stop here. By his order the vessel that Gadifer had sent to the fort at Lancerota was seized. Remonnet tried resistance, but his numbers were too small, and his supplications were useless to prevent Berneval's men, and even Berneval himself, from destroying all the arms, furniture, and goods which Béthencourt had placed in the fort at Lancerota. Insults were showered upon the governor, and Berneval cried, "I should like Gadifer de la Salle to know that if he were as young as I would kill him, but as he is not, I will spare him. If he is put above me I shall have him drowned, and then he can fish for sea wolves." Meanwhile Gadifer and his 10 companions were in danger of perishing on the island of Lobos for want of food and fresh water, but happily the 2 chaplains of the fort of Lancerota had gone to Graziosa, and met with Coxon, who had been the victim of Berneval's treason, and he sent one of his men named Ximenes with them back to Lancerota. There they found a small boat which they filled with provisions, and embarking with 4 men who were faithful to Gadifer, they succeeded in reaching Lobos, 4 leagues off, after a most dangerous passage. Gadifer and his companions were suffering fearfully from hunger and thirst, when Ximenes arrived, just in time to save them from perishing, and the governor, learning Berneval's treachery, embarked in the boat for Lancerota, as soon as he was a little restored to health. He was grieved at Berneval's conduct towards the poor islanders whom Béthencourt and he had sworn to protect. No, he never could have expected such wickedness in one who was looked upon as the most able of the whole band. But what was Berneval doing meanwhile? After having betrayed his master, he did the same to the companions who had aided him in his evil deeds. He had 12 of them killed, and then he set out for Spain to rejoin Béthencourt and make his own case good by representing all that had happened in his own way. It was to his interest to get rid of inconvenient witnesses, and therefore he abandoned his companions. These unfortunate men at first meditated imploring the pardon of the governor. They confessed all to the chaplains, but then, fearing the consequences of their deeds, they seized a boat and fled toward Morocco. The boat reached the coast of Barbary, where 10 of the crew were drowned and the 2 others taken for slaves. While all this was happening at Lancerota, Béthencourt arrived at Cadiz, where he took strong measures against his mutinous crew, and had the ringleaders imprisoned. Then he sent his vessel to Seville, where King Henry III. was at that time. But the ship sank in the Guadalquivir, a great loss to Gadifer, her owner. Béthencourt, having arrived at Seville, met a certain Francisque Calve, who had lately come from the Canaries, and who offered to return thither with all the things needed by the governor, but Béthencourt could not agree to this proposal before he had seen the king. Just at this time Berneval arrived with some of his accomplices and some islanders whom he intended to sell as slaves. He hoped to be able to deceive Béthencourt, but he had not reckoned upon a certain Courtille who was with him, who lost no time in denouncing the villainy of Berneval, and on whose word the traitors were all imprisoned at Cadiz. Courtille also told of the treatment that the poor islanders had received. As Béthencourt could not leave Seville till he had an audience with the king, he gave orders that they should receive every kindness, but while these preliminaries were being concluded, the vessel that contained them was taken to Aragon, and they were sold for slaves. Béthencourt obtained the audience that he sought with the King of Castile, and after telling him the result of his expedition, he said, "Sire, I come to ask your assistance and your leave to conquer the Canary Islands for the Catholic faith, And as you are king and lord of all the surrounding country, and the nearest Christian king to these islands, I beg you to receive the homage of your humble servant." The king was very gracious to him, and gave him dominion over these islands, and beyond this, a fifth of all the merchandise that should be brought from them to Spain. He gave him 20,000 maravedis, about £600, to buy all that he needed, and also the right to coin money in the Canary Islands. Most unfortunately, these 20,000 maravedis were confided to the care of a dishonest man, who fled to France carrying the money with him. However, Henry III. gave Béthencourt a well-rigged vessel manned by 80 men and stocked with provisions, arms, etc. He was most grateful for this fresh bounty, and sent Gadifer an account of all that had happened, and his extreme disappointment and disgust at Berneval's conduct, in whom he had so much confidence, announcing at the same time the speedy departure of the vessel given by the King of Castile. But meanwhile very serious troubles had arisen on Lancerota. King Guardafia was so hurt at Berneval's conduct that he had revolted, and some of Gadifer's companions had been killed by the islanders. Gadifer insisted upon these subjects being punished, when one of the king's relations, named Ache, came to him, proposing to dethrone the king and put himself in his place. This Ache was a villain, who, after having betrayed his king, proposed to betray the Normans, and to chase them from the country. Gadifer had no suspicion of his motives. Wishing to avenge the death of his men, he accepted Ache's proposal, and a short time afterwards, on the vigil of St. Catherine's Day, the king was seized and conveyed to the fort in chains. Some days afterwards, Ache, the new king of the island, attacked Gadifer's companions, mortally wounding several of them. But the following night, Guardafia, having made his escape from the fort, seized Ache, had him stoned to death, and his body burnt. The governor, Gadifer, was so grieved by these scenes of violence, which were renewed daily, that he resolved to kill all the men on the island, and save only the women and children, whom he hoped to have baptized. But just at this time the vessel that Béthencourt had freighted for the governor arrived, and brought besides the 80 men, provisions, etc., a letter which told him among other things that Béthencourt had done homage to the King of Castile for the Canary Islands. The governor was not well pleased at this news, for he thought that he ought to have had his share in the islands, but he concealed his displeasure, and gave the newcomers a hearty welcome. The arms were at once disembarked, and then Gadifer went on board the vessel to explore the neighbouring islands. Remonnet and several others joined him in this expedition, and they took 2 of the islanders with them to serve as guides. They arrived safely at Fortaventura Island. A few days after landing on the island, Gadifer set out with 35 men to explore the country, but soon the greater part of his followers deserted him, only 13 men, including 2 archers, remaining with him. But he did not give up his project. After wading through a large stream, he found himself in a lovely valley shaded by numberless palm trees. Here, having rested and refreshed himself, he set out again and climbed a hill. At the summit he found about 50 natives, who surrounded the small party and threatened to murder them. Gadifer and his companions showed no signs of fear, and succeeded in putting their enemies to flight. By the evening they were able to regain their vessel, carrying away 4 of the native women as prisoners. The next day Gadifer left the island and went to the Gran Canaria island, anchoring in a large harbour lying between Telde and Argoni. 500 of the natives confronted them, but apparently with no hostile intentions. They gave them some fish hooks and old iron in exchange for some of the natural productions of the island, such as figs and dragon's blood, a resinous substance taken from the dragon tree, which has a very pleasant balsamic odour. The natives were very much on their guard with the strangers, for 20 years before this some of Captain Lopez's men had invaded the island, so they would not allow Gadifer to land. The governor was obliged to weigh anchor without exploring the island. He went to Faro Island, and coasting along it arrived next at Gomera. It was night, and the sailors were attracted by the fires that the natives had lighted on the shore. When day broke, Gadifer and his companions wished to land, but the islanders would not allow them to proceed when they reached the shore, and drove them back to their vessel. Much disappointed by his reception, Gadifer determined to make another attempt at Faroe Island, where he found that he could land without opposition, and he remained on the island 22 days. The interior of the island was very beautiful. Pine trees grew in abundance, and clear streams of water added to its fertility. Quails were found in large numbers, as well as pigs, goats, and sheep. From this fertile island the party of explorers went to Palma, and anchored in a harbor situated to the right of a large river. This is the furthest island of the Canary group. It is covered with pine and dragon trees. From the abundance of fresh water, the pasturage is excellent, and the land might be cultivated with much profit. Its inhabitants are a tall, robust race, well made, with good features and very white skin. Gadifer remained a short time on this island. On leaving it, he spent 2 days and 2 nights sailing round the other islands, and then returned to the fort on Lancerota. They had been absent 3 months. In the meantime, those of the party who had been left in the fort had waged a petty war with the natives, and had made a great number of prisoners. The Canarians, demoralized, now came daily to cast themselves on their mercy, and to pray for the consecration of baptism. Gadifer was so pleased to hear of this that he sent one of his companions to Spain to inform Béthencourt of the state of the colony. End of first part, Chapter 6, Part 1. Recording by William Tomko. Section 12 of Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by William Tomko. Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 1. Exploration of the World by Jules Verne. First part, Chapter 6, Part 2. The envoy had not reached Cadiz when Béthencourt landed at the fort on Lancerota. Gadifer gave him a hearty welcome, and so did the Canary Islanders who had been baptized. A few days afterwards King Guardafia came and threw himself on their mercy. He was baptized on the 20th of February, 1404, with all his followers. Béthencourt's chaplains drew up a very simple form of instruction for their use, embracing the principal elements of Christianity: the creation, Adam and Eve's fall, the history of Noah, the lives of the patriarchs, the life of our Saviour and his crucifixion by the Jews, finishing with an exhortation to believe the 10 Commandments, the Holy Sacrament of the altar, Easter, confession, and some other points. Béthencourt was an ambitious man. Not content with having explored, and so to speak, gained possession of the Canary Islands, he desired to conquer the African countries bordering on the ocean. This was his secret wish in returning to Lancerota, and meanwhile he had full occupation in establishing his authority in these islands, of which he was only the nominal sovereign. He gave himself wholly to the task, and first visited the islands which Gadifer had explored. But before he set out, a conversation took place between Gadifer and himself, which we must not omit to notice. Gadifer began boasting of all he had done, and asked for the gift of Fortaventura, Teneriffe, and Gomera Islands as a recompense. "My friend," replied Béthencourt, "the islands that you ask me to give you are not yet conquered. But I do not intend you to be at any loss for your trouble, nor that you should be unrequited. But let us accomplish our project, and meanwhile remain the friends we have always been." "That is all very well," replied Gadifer, "but there is one point on which I do not feel at all satisfied, and that is that you have done homage to the King of Castile for these islands, and so you call yourself absolute master over them." "With regard to that," said Béthencourt, "I certainly have done homage for them, and so I am their rightful master. But if you will only patiently wait the end of our affair, I will give you what I feel sure will quite content you." "I shall not remain here," replied Gadifer. "I am going back to France, and have no wish to be here any longer." Upon this they separated, but Gadifer gradually cooled down and agreed to accompany Béthencourt in his exploration of the islands. They set out for Fortaventura well armed and with plenty of provisions. They remained there 3 months, and began by seizing a number of the natives and sending them to Lancerota. This was such a usual mode of proceeding at that time that we are less surprised at it than we should be at the present day. The whole island was explored and a fort named Rasheroque built on the slope of a high mountain. Traces of it may still be found in a hamlet there. Just at this time, and when he had scarcely had time to forget his grievances and ill humor, Gadifer accepted the command of a small band of men who were to conquer Gran Canaria. He set out on the 25th July, 1404. But this expedition was not fated to meet with any good results. Winds and waves were against it. At last they reached the port of Telde, but it was nearly dark, and a strong wind blowing they dared not land, and they went on to the little town of Aginmez, where they remained 11 days at anchor. The natives, encouraged by their king, laid an ambush for Gadifer and his followers. There was a skirmish, blood was shed, and the Castilians, feeling themselves outnumbered, went to Telde for 2 days, and thence to Lancerota. Gadifer was much disappointed at his want of success, and began to be discontented with everything around him. Above all, his jealousy of Béthencourt increased daily, and he gave way to violent recriminations, saying openly that the chief had not done everything himself, and that things would not have been in so advanced a stage as they were if others had not aided him. This reached Béthencourt's ears. He was much incensed, and reproached Gadifer. High words followed. Gadifer insisted upon leaving the country, and as Béthencourt had just made arrangements for returning to Spain, he proposed to Gadifer to accompany him, that their cause of disagreement might be inquired into. This proposal being accepted, they set sail, but each in his own ship. When they reached Seville, Gadifer laid his complaints before the king, but as the king gave judgment against him, fully approving of Béthencourt's conduct, he left Spain, and, returning to France, never revisited the Canary Islands, which he had so fondly hoped to conquer for himself. Béthencourt took leave of the king almost at the same time, for the new colony demanded his immediate presence there. But before he left, the inhabitants of Seville, with whom he was a great favorite, showed him much kindness. What he valued more highly than anything else was the supply of arms, gold, silver, and provisions that they gave him. He went to Fortaventura, where his companions were delighted to see him. Gadifer had left his son Hannibal in his place, but Béthencourt treated him with much cordiality. The first days of the installation of Béthencourt were far from peaceful. Skirmishes were of constant occurrence, the natives even destroying the fortress of Richeroque, after burning and pillaging a chapel. Béthencourt was determined to overcome them, and in the end succeeded. He sent for several of his men from Lancerota, and gave orders that the fortress should be rebuilt. In spite of all this, the combats began again, and many of the islanders fell, among others a giant of 9 feet high, whom Béthencourt would have liked to have made prisoner. The governor could not trust Gadifer's son nor the men who followed him, for Hannibal seemed to have inherited his father's jealousy, but as Béthencourt needed his help, he concealed his distrust. Happily, Béthencourt's men outnumbered those who were faithful to Gadifer, but Hannibal's taunts became so unbearable that Jean de Courtois was sent to remind him of his oath of obedience, and to advise him to keep it. Courtois was very badly received, he having a crow to pick with Hannibal with regard to some native prisoners whom Gadifer's followers had kept and would not give up. Hannibal was obliged to obey the orders, but Courtois represented his conduct to Béthencourt on his return in the very worst light, and tried to excite his master's anger against him. "No, sir," answered the upright Béthencourt, "I do not wish him to be wronged. We must never carry our power to its utmost limits. We should always endeavor to control ourselves and preserve our honor rather than seek for profit. In spite of these intestine discords, the war continued between the natives and the conquerors, but the latter, being well armed, always came off victorious. The kings of Fortaventura sent a native to Béthencourt, saying that they wished to make peace with him, and to become Christians. This news delighted the conqueror, and he sent word that they would be well received if they would come to him. Almost immediately on receiving this reply, King Maxorata, who governed the northwesterly part of the island, set out, and with his suite of 22 persons, was baptized on the 18th of January, 1405. 3 days afterwards 22 other natives received the sacrament of baptism. On the 25th of January, the king, who governed the peninsula of Handia, the southeastern part of the island, came with 26 of his subjects and was baptized. In a short time all the inhabitants of Fortaventura had embraced the Christian religion. Béthencourt was so elated with these happy results that he arranged to revisit his own country, leaving Courtois as governor during his absence. He set out on the last day of January amid the prayers and blessings of his people, taking with him 3 native men and 1 woman, to whom he wished to show something of France. He reached Harfleur in 21 days, and 2 days later was at his own house, where he only intended making a short stay, and then returning to the Canary Islands. He met with a very warm reception from everybody. One of his chief motives in returning to France was the hope of finding people of all classes ready to return with him, on the promise of grants of land in the island. He succeeded in finding a certain number of emigrants, amongst whom were 28 soldiers, of whom 23 took their wives. 2 vessels were prepared to transport the party, and the 6th of May was the day named for them to set out. On the 9th of May they set sail, and landed on Lancerota just 4 months and a half after Béthencourt had quitted it. He was received with trumpets, clarionets, tambourines, harps, and other musical instruments. Thunder could scarcely have been heard above the sound of this music. The natives celebrated his return by dancing and singing, and crying out, "Here comes our king!" Jean de Courtois hastened to welcome his master, who asked him how everything was going on. He replied, "Sir, all is going on as well as possible." Béthencourt's companions stayed with him at the fort of Lancerota. They appeared much pleased with the country, enjoying the dates and other fruits on the island, and nothing seemed to harm them. After they had been a short time at Lancerota, Béthencourt went with them to see Fortaventura, and here his reception was as warm as it had been at Lancerota, especially from the islanders and their 2 kings. The kings supped with them at the fortress of Richeroque, which Courtois had rebuilt. Béthencourt announced his intention of conquering Gran Canaria Island, as he had done Lancerota and Fortaventura. His hope was that his nephew, Maciot, whom he had brought with him from France, would succeed him in the government of these islands, so that the name of Béthencourt might be perpetuated there. He imparted his project to Courtois, who highly approved of it, and added, "Sir, when you return to France, I will go with you. I am a bad husband. It is 5 years since I saw my wife, and, by my troth, she did not much care about it." The 6th of October, 1405, was the day fixed for starting for Gran Canaria, but contrary winds carried the ships towards the African coast, and they passed by Cape Bojador, where Béthencourt landed. He made an expedition 24 miles inland, and seized some natives and a great number of camels that he took to his vessels. They put as many of the camels as possible on board, wishing to acclimatize them in the Canary Islands, and the Baron set sail again, leaving Cape Bojador, which he had the honour of seeing 30 years before the Portuguese navigators. During this voyage from the coast of Africa to Gran Canaria, the 3 vessels were separated in stormy weather, one going to Palma and another to Fortaventura, but finally they all reached Gran Canaria. This island is 60 miles long and 36 miles broad. At the northern end it is flat, but very hilly towards the south. Firs, dragon trees, olive, fig, and date trees form large forests, and sheep, goats, and wild dogs are found here in large numbers. The soil is very fertile, and produces 2 crops of corn every year, and that without any means of improving it. Its inhabitants form a large body of people and consider themselves all on an equality. When Béthencourt had landed, he set to work at once to conquer the island. Unfortunately, his Norman soldiers were so proud of their success on the coast of Africa that they thought they could conquer this island with its 10,000 natives with a mere handful of men. Béthencourt, seeing that they were so confident of success, recommended them to be prudent, but they took no heed of this, and bitterly they rued their confidence. After a skirmish in which they seem to have got the better of the islanders, they had left their ranks, when the natives surprised them, massacring 22 of them, including Jean de Courtois and Hannibal, Gadifer's son. After this sad affair, Béthencourt left Gran Canaria and went to try to subdue Palma. The natives of this island were very clever in slinging stones, rarely missing their aim, and in the encounters with these islanders many fell on both sides, but more natives than Normans, whose loss, however, amounted to 100. After 6 weeks of skirmishing, Béthencourt left Palma, and went to Ferro for 3 months, a large island 21 miles long and 15 broad. It is a flat table land, and large woods of pine and laurel trees shade it in many places. The mists, which are frequent, moisten the soil and make it especially favorable for the cultivation of corn and the vine. Game is abundant. Pigs, goats, and sheep run wild about the country. There are also great lizards in shape like the iguana of America. The inhabitants, both men and women, are a very fine race, healthy, lively, agile, and particularly well made. In fact, Ferro is one of the pleasantest islands of the group. Béthencourt returned to Fortaventura with his ships after conquering Ferro and Palma. This island is 51 miles in length by 24 in breadth, and has high mountains as well as large plains, but its surface is less undulating than that of the other islands. Large streams of fresh water run through the island. The euphorbia, a deadly poison, grows largely here, and date and olive trees are abundant, as well as a plant that is invaluable for dyeing, and whose cultivation would be most remunerative. The coast of Fortaventura has no good harbors for large vessels, but small ones can anchor there quite safely. It was in this island that Béthencourt began to make a partition of land to the colonists, and he succeeded in doing it so evenly that every one was satisfied with his portion. Those colonists whom he had brought with him were to be exempted from taxes for 9 years. The question of religion and religious administration could not fail to be of the deepest interest to so pious a man as Béthencourt, so he resolved to go to Rome and try to obtain a bishop for this country, who would order and adorn the Roman Catholic faith. Before setting out, he appointed his nephew Maciot as lieutenant and governor of the islands. Under his orders 2 sergeants were to act and enforce justice. He desired that twice a year news of the colony should be sent to him in Normandy, and the revenue from Lancerota and Fortaventura was to be devoted to building 2 churches. He said to his nephew Maciot, "I give you full authority in everything to do whatever you think best, and I believe you will do all for my honor and to my advantage. Follow as nearly as possible Norman and French customs, especially in the administration of justice. Above all things, try and keep peace and unity among yourselves, and care for each other as brothers, and specially try that there shall be no rivalry among the gentlemen. I have given to each one his share, and the country is quite large enough for each to have his own sphere. I can tell you nothing further beyond again impressing the importance of your all living as good friends together, and then all will be well." Béthencourt remained 3 months in Fortaventura and the other islands. He rode about among the people on his mule, and found many of the natives beginning to speak Norman French. Maciot and the other gentlemen accompanied him. He pointed out what was best to be done and the most honest way of doing it. Then he gave notice that he would set out for Rome on the ensuing 15th of December. Returning to Lancerota, he remained there till his departure, and ordered all the gentlemen he had brought with him, the workmen, and the 3 kings to appear before him 2 days before his departure, to tell them what he wished done, and to commend himself and them to God's protection. None failed to appear at this meeting. They were all received at the fort on Lancerota and sumptuously entertained. When the repast was over, he spoke to them, especially impressing the duty of obedience to his nephew Maciot upon them, the retention of the fifth of everything for himself, and also the exercise of all Christian virtues and of fervent love to God. This done, he chose those who were to accompany him to Rome, and prepared to set out. His vessel had scarcely set sail when cries and groans were heard on all sides, both Europeans and natives alike regretting this just master, who they feared would never return to them. A great number waded into the water and tried to stop the vessel that carried him away from them, but the sails were set, and Béthencourt was really gone. "May God keep him safe from all harm," was the utterance of many that day. In a week he was at Seville. From thence he went to Valladolid, where the king received him very graciously. He related the narrative of his conquests to the king, and requested from him letters recommending him to the Pope, that he might have a bishop appointed for the islands. The king gave him the letters, and loaded him with gifts, and then Béthencourt set out for Rome with a numerous retinue. He remained 3 weeks in the Eternal City, and was admitted to kiss Pope Innocent VII's foot, who complimented him on his having made so many proselytes to the Christian faith, and on his bravery in having ventured so far from his native country. When the bulls were prepared as Béthencourt had requested, and Albert de Maison was appointed Bishop of the Canary Islands, the Norman took leave of the Pope after receiving his blessing. The new prelate took leave of Béthencourt, and set out at once for his diocese. He went by way of Spain, taking with him some letters from Béthencourt to the king. Then he set sail for Fortaventura, and arrived there without any obstacle. Maciot gave him a cordial reception, and the bishop at once began to organize his diocese, governing with gentleness and courtesy, preaching now in one island, now in another, and offering up public prayers for Béthencourt's safety. Maciot was universally beloved, but especially by the natives. This happy, peaceful time only lasted for 5 years, for later on Maciot began to abuse his unlimited power, and levied such heavy exactions that he was obliged to fly the country to save his life. Béthencourt, after leaving Rome, went to Florence and to Paris, and then to his own chateau, where a great number of people came to pay their respects to the King of the Canary Islands, and if on his return the first time he was much thought of, his reception the second time far exceeded it. Béthencourt established himself at Grainville, although he was an old man. His wife was still young. He had frequent accounts from the Maciot of his beloved islands, and he hoped one day to return to his kingdom, but God willed otherwise. One day, in the year 1425, he was seized with what proved to be fatal illness. He was aware that the end was near, and after making his will, and receiving the last sacraments of the Church, he passed away. "May God keep him and pardon his sins," says the narrative of his life. He is buried in the church of Grainville la Teinturière, in front of the high altar. End of first part, chapter 6, part 2.